Welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb, and thank you very much for listening. Today, in another first for the podcast, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by a colleague from the legal profession, namely Richard Bonnar. Richard has spent over 20 years at DLA Piper, where he specialised in advising on major projects within government, and he rose there to become a partner. He left the business in June of 2022 to pursue other opportunities, but he's still very active in this space, including working part-time as a professor at the School of Law in Leeds University. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. Given your extensive background in the legal perspective on UK government procurement, I'm sure there are loads of really interesting things that our listeners would love to cover off in this conversation. But perhaps a good place to start would be, from your perspective, what do you think are the challenges facing UK public sector procurement at the moment?
Well, there are many and varied. And if you set aside the political challenges, I think the first challenge facing government procurement is just the eternal challenge of more for less. That now in the context of kind of raging inflation. And I think, if you look at infrastructure projects or indeed all projects, the debate about how do we squeeze best value for money is raging strong. And I think, in government, we've got a big tension between preserving taxpayers' money as rightly procurers want to do, and on the broader sense of delivering value. We saw with the collapse of Carillion and other things that have gone on as well, that when government pushes too hard on lowest costs and when you get markets that evolve so that they trend towards lowest cost, then there are some unforeseen and unfortunate consequences.
Yeah. One of the things that's obviously a big change about to come up in UK government procurement, particularly, is the stuff about procurement reform and procurement bill. We have a very international audience for this podcast. So perhaps in really basic terms, could we start by what even is that? Why is procurement reform and procurement reform bill a subject of conversation in the UK at the moment?
The UK, as we all know, left the European Union. And when it did so, then it had the opportunity to review its procurement law rulebook, which currently is derived from the EU. So the UK is essentially taking a once-in-a-generation opportunity to look again at the way procurement law works and to bring it into line with UK public policy aspirations and UK requirements. So it's obviously being promoted, if you like, as a Brexit dividend, but that's the context. Now, having said all that, obviously the UK is signatory to the GPA, Global Procurement Agreement, and also entered into a bilateral agreement with the European Union. So it's not as if the UK has got a completely free hand in terms of what it does with public procurement law and policy and practice, but within those parameters, it is going about reforming public procurement law in quite a material way. And I emphasize law because, I think we need to, maybe we'll touch on this as we go through the conversation. Yes, the law is being reformed, but whether that leads to better procurement practice is another thing altogether, but it's the law that's being reformed.
Understood. And where are we in that process of reform from a timeline perspective?
So it's been quite a prolonged timeline. So we started off with a green paper, I think December 20, then a response from the government after consultation. A bill was introduced in May of last year. It's been through the House of Lords and it's currently going through the Public Bill Committee in the House of Commons. So nobody really knows when the bill will be enacted. What we do know is that once it's enacted, there'll be a 6-month grace period. Realistically, when will we see the bill come into effect? At the end of this calendar year, and I would guess maybe more likely next quarter of 2024. That doesn't mean, though, that we should all be kind of sitting back and waiting for this all to happen. There's quite a lot to get our heads around as the bill progresses its way through the statutory process.
Richard, and as we understand it at the moment, is your view this is an evolution of existing rules? Is this a revolution? I mean, what's your view?
Well, that is a raging debate amongst practitioners, and I think perspectives do vary. I think it's somewhere in between. It's definitely, there's a conscious step away from the EU framework, the EU vocabulary, the EU way of doing things. So it's more than evolution for sure, and there's some quite interesting and in places radical ideas.
Okay.
But have we gone the full hog, and could we have been, if you like, more revolutionary? Then, potentially yes. So I think it's somewhere along that spectrum. But let's not underestimate it. For procurement practitioners, it is going to mean quite a big change to the way, the legal framework for how we go about the practice of public procurement over quite a long period of time.
And Richard, you mentioned there are elements in the bill that you think are quite radical or quite revolutionary. Could you bring that to life maybe with some specifics for our listeners of what areas are quite radically different?
Yeah, well, I think maybe I could start with transparency. So obviously transparency is built into the European rule book already, but the UK is making a big leap forward. And so transparency will be built into public procurement really from cradle through to grave. So public sector organisations will be required to publish pipeline notices, which will give transparency as to what they're intending to procure. Then as you go through the procurement life cycle and after the contract has been awarded, there will be a continuing information provided when contracts are changed, when they're terminated, when there are performance issues, quite a significantly enhanced transparency regime. And then sitting alongside that, a single digital platform, which will lock into all the other different procurement systems that are out there, and that will enable users to access information. And also, I think if you are supplying good services or works to the public sector, that one of the ideas is that we move away from the current approach, which is quite annoying, whereby every time you tender for something you have to rekey your information in again. So the idea is it will be much more, tell us once forever type scenario than currently is the case. So transparency, I think, is a big step forward. And some people are saying we could have been bolder, but I think there's plenty there for people to be getting on with, and a big burden for the public sector and a big burden for government contractors as well, but also a big opportunity because there'll be lots of data out there and therefore lots of information. And with that, hopefully, contractors will be able to do a lot more in the government marketplace. So that's one thing. The other thing that has been a big play for government is, I guess, an enhanced approach to the management of contractors and to the ability of the government to exclude contractors which it doesn't consider to be fit for purpose. And alongside that, we're introducing into the UK for the first time, this isn't in the EU system, a debarment regime. So the idea behind a debarment regime is that you can exclude a contractor not just from a single public sector opportunity, but from all opportunities in the government marketplace for a specific period of time. So that's a big leap forward. And I will, again, is going to produce quite a significant compliance burden for contractors. And I think for government in itself is going to be kind of quite a challenge in terms of how it beds this new approach in. I think that's all new. We have a new single streamlined compliance regime. So as you know, Simon, historically, we've got different regimes for defence and security, and it's all going to sit under one roof now with some exceptions, a single set of rules. That's going to be particularly helpful for the defence community. Then we've got some streamlined processes. So at the minute, there are 5 main processes under the European Union rules. There's going to be boiled right down. There's going to be essentially what's called a competitive flexible procedure, which will allow authorities much more flexibility in terms of how they go about procuring goods, works and services. And I think will give us scope for innovation and potentially negotiation as well. So lots going on there.
Yeah. You mentioned also, Richard, that although they're going through the process, it doesn't mean there aren't things that people should be thinking about preparing for ahead of. Really interested in your views on that. If you were working in procurement in the public sector at this point in time, what would you be thinking about starting to do around this topic?
First of all, there is lots of really good material out there that the Cabinet Office has published. And there is a checklist that the Cabinet Office has published, which gives authorities some ideas about what they should be doing. There's going to be a long tail, if you like, from the existing legal framework, because there's going to be a bunch of frameworks that we're going to run on for quite a long period of time. But what should contracting authorities be doing now? First of all, fully engaging with the programme, and I think many are.
Yeah.
They should be looking at the L&D materials that the Cabinet Office has published. But thirdly, most importantly, I think they need to be coming up with their own route map, Simon. They need to be saying, well, look, if the end goal is go live in December 23 or March 2024, or, whenever that is going to be, what's my route map to get me ready for that particular moment in time? Training for my staff? Is it familiarising with the new rule book? The biggest immediate burdens, if you like, is going to be the new transparency regime and the pipeline notices and all the other, new information that's going to have to be put out there. Now, we don't know what the transitional rules are going to be and how much look back there's going to be to existing contracts, but that's what I'd be focusing on right now in the next kind of 12 months.
Yeah. As we said, listeners to this podcast will be very broad in terms of both internationally, but also lots of people from the private sector. Really interested now, are there implications there? Are there, if you're a CPO in a private sector company in the UK, are there things you should be thinking about in terms of this bill? Or if you're in other parts of Europe, what does the change look like back into the UK as opposed to just within the UK?
If you're a government contractor in the UK, then there are definitely lots of things to be thinking about. So let's remember that, as we know, Simon, the UK is heavily dependent on many non-UK based contractors for delivery of works, goods and services. So what should those organisations all be doing? I think the first thing is they should be keeping up to speed with the bill as it develops. I would still urge industry to interact with the bill and interact with the process, because there still is some opportunity for change. Whilst I don't think the government is really for turning in terms of the fundamentals, there is certainly room for improvements and tweaks and so on. So I think there is an opportunity to an extent to influence the passage of the bill. I think then it's a case of preparation. And I suppose there are two sides to the coin. One is obligation and the other is opportunity. So in terms of obligation, I think the biggest issue for contractors going forward will be the enhanced exclusion and debarment regime, which casts the net much more widely. And so for global contractors will mean that the information they have to supply to the UK government, UK public sector entities when they bid for work here will be significantly greater, and there is greater compliance risk. So I think you need a kind of compliance roadmap. Then also, in terms of live contracts, there's going to be much greater scrutiny of those contracts. There'll be annual KPIs will be published and so on. So I think, again, contracting organisations will need a strategy to address how they deal, with the reputational and other issues that may arise from that as well. So those are the obligations. On the kind of upside, as the transparency regime takes root and as the information gets out there, I think there'll be more opportunity as well, because you look earlier sight of poorly performing contractors, opportunities that are coming down the line in 12, 18 months that will enable government contractors to target those. So it's a bit of both, Simon.
Yeah. Richard, as we said, you're a man with enormous experience in terms of working in government on, I imagine, lots of big, complicated projects. I'm sure some have gone incredibly well, some I'm sure probably haven't. I'm really interested in your perspective on why is there some examples of big government projects failing, like Carillion and other places, and on the other side also some succeed. I mean, really interested in your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, like you say, Simon, over 20 years plus mainly in transformational government projects, I have seen the good, the bad and the ugly. So I think one of the challenges with government projects is they are significantly greater in scale than anything that comes in the private sector. So we all know that scale brings difficulty. The iron law of mega projects is that they go over budget over time and under benefits over and over again. I think to quote Professor Flyberg on this. So I think, large scale government projects, the scale is a problem. The politics and the policy is a problem, because as we all know, when ministers get involved and policy changes, that drives change down the line in the contract. So all of those are very difficult. I think the government contracting marketplace is difficult everywhere and in the UK as well. Depending on what else is going on economically, it's not always as an attractive marketplace to operate in. So I think government, probably more than ever, to work hard to cultivate the sell side and to make government opportunities attractive. So, we've all seen our fair share of projects that fail, and I guess there probably won't be any end to those, despite all the really good work of the IPA and the NAO and the GCF, government commercial function. Why do projects succeed? I think they succeed. When I think of those that have gone really well, one of the first projects I was involved with was Transport for London's congestion charging scheme. It was a couple of decades ago. Why did that work? I think it worked because there was really strong leadership from the top, from the Mayor of London at the time. There was a strong adherence to schedule. There was a lot of capable resource devoted to the project. there was a desire to keep it simple, stupid, and not to chase tomorrow's technology when maybe yesterday's technology would do. And there was a strategic intent there, preparedness to handle a bunch of obstacles along the way. So, I think a lot of those things help deliver that project on time. We do see, Simon, lots of successful government projects. It's just inevitable that we focus on those in the UK and elsewhere which are not successful.
Yeah, human nature, I guess. Richard, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. It's really, really interesting. As you say, big changes coming down the line in government procurement, and it's fantastic to get such an informed perspective from an individual like yourself. So thank you.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please click the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also absolutely love to hear your views. So please do leave us a review on those platforms, or indeed send me a message on LinkedIn. And we'll be back soon for another discussion with senior industry figures.